country. Then we entered World War II. We created a treaty with Mexico to allow Mexican citizens to cross our borders freely to come in and work because all of our men were off. We didn't have enough U.S. citizen women to do all the work, so we asked our Mexican neighbors to come in and work during the war effort. And at that time, we also repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act because we needed more people coming to this country to work. After World War II, and with the rise of the Cold War, Congress limited immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere, but not the Western. They created a visa category for skilled workers and, for the first time, relatives of U.S. citizens. And then they implemented heightened screening procedures. In 1965, Congress eliminated quotas by eliminating the word quota from the law. But they still set a maximum number of visas, and these are immigrant visas. These are green cards. These are not tourist visas or student visas. These are green card visas, permanent residency. 300,000, and then they further set a per country limit for the Eastern Hemisphere, but not the Western. And then they canceled the Brasileira program, so Mexican citizens were no longer allowed to cross our border freely. From 1976 to 1978, the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, that's the same one referenced by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. It's the same law that we have today in 2024. That is the basis of our immigration system. 1976 to 1978, we decided to further restrict immigration from Mexico because Mexico was the only country to exceed 20,000 green card visas prior to 1976. We decided to limit Mexico to 20,000 a year. We lowered the worldwide quota. And then we passed a law that said only U.S. citizen children aged 21 can petition for parents. So no more anchor babies. So if you hear anyone that talks about anchor babies, there hasn't been an anchor baby born in this country since 1978. U.S. citizen children have to be 21 years old before they can petition for a parent born in another country. In 1980, Congress passed the Refugee Act, which established our modern asylum system, which is the exact same one we still have today in 2024. You know, it's been over 58 years since the Immigration Nationality Act was created by Congress. And then, you know, since 1980, the world's moved on a little bit. Lots of our laws have been modernized, but not our immigration system. So it's very important that you bear the context in mind, that our immigration system is still from the last century, even though we're trying to deal with 21st century issues. In 1986, because we so severely limited visas, green card visas for immigrants from Mexico, but yet we had a huge need for migrant workers in this country, we had this huge population of undocumented agricultural workers. And so President Reagan said of Mexicans, they're not aliens, they're our neighbors. And these are people that we need working. So President Reagan signed a legalization program into law known as the amnesty. So agricultural workers in the United States, undocumented workers, could apply for green cards. Congress also passed a worker visa program, which should have been capable of meeting our economic demands year to year, except for Congress set an arbitrary limit on work visas and only in certain categories, not actually tied to our labor demands in this country at all. In 1990, they raised the worldwide quota of green card visas to 700,000. They created the diversity lottery, They retained family-based immigration and doubled employment-based immigration. But again, an arbitrary number that cannot be changed year to year, or even every 2 years or 3 years. It's just a number set by Congress in the 1990s. And again, in the 1990s, those work visas were insufficient to meet the actual demand in the United States for labor. So once again, we accumulated a very large undocumented population in the United States. President Clinton decided to take the opposite approach than President Reagan did. And so what Clinton did was he signed the harshest immigration law we have ever had in this country. It created immigration detention, mandatory detention for the first time for people who were not here lawfully. It limited federal court review of federal agency immigration decisions. So you lose in front of an immigration judge, you lose in front of an immigration agency, you can't go into federal court and have an Article III federal judge review that decision. So eliminated that check on the executive. It limited relief from deportation. So there were fewer applications people who were in deportation proceedings could make to try and stay here. And then it expanded the grounds of deportation and exclusions, creating more immigration violations that would disqualify people from getting legal status in the future. So it created a lot more obstacles for even those people who had a right way to apply in the future or in the present. It made it a lot harder. So it was a very harsh law. So the upshot of the U.S. immigration system is the majority of people in this world do not have a legal way to immigrate to the United States. There is no application that they can make. They can't mail it to a federal agency and say, hey, take a look at me. I'm a good person. I'm a hard worker. I would like the opportunity to come to the United States. Doesn't exist. The three main ways to immigrate to the United States is if you have a qualifying family member who can petition for you, or an employer who has gotten their petition for you approved by the Department of Labor, or through asylum or refugee process. There never was, and is still not a line for 10 million undocumented immigrants to get in. And this drives me nuts as an immigration attorney. When I hear someone say, well, Congress can't let people apply for legalization in this country because there are other people in line ahead of them. They don't even have a line. Give them a line then. Or we could eliminate lines for everyone. And there is a very orderly way, fair way to do that. All right. So people that talk about lines, here are the lines. If you don't fall into, if you are not the immediate relative of a U.S. citizen, which means the spouse, parent of a U.S. citizen age 21, or the unmarried child under the age of 21 of a U.S. citizen, you have to fall into one of these lines. If you don't, there's no line for you. The F1 category line is for adult unmarried sons and daughters of U.S. citizens. The F2A category is for spouses and unmarried children under the age of 21 of green card holders, permanent residents. The F2B category is for adult unmarried sons and daughters of green card holders. The F3 category is for married sons and daughters of U.S. citizens. And the F4 category is for siblings of U.S. citizens. There is no category for married sons and daughters of green card holders. There is no category for aunts and uncles. There's no category for nieces and nephews. There's no category for cousins or even for grandparents. So then, not only do you have to fall into one of those categories, then a visa number has to be available. And remember, these visas are limited to 226,000 worldwide, okay? They're limited. And then, if you're from one of these 4 countries, China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines, they're even further limited. So these dates in these boxes, in the F1 category, if I'm a US citizen and I want to file a petition for my 22-year-old daughter, who's a Mexican citizen, to immigrate to the United States, I'm going to file my petition for her today, Juneteenth, 2024. And at this moment, there are visas available in that category for petitions that were filed in April of 2001. So I'm going to file my petition for my daughter to immigrate legally to the United States today, and it's going to be 25 years before she gets her interview for the visa. If I am a green card holder, a permanent resident, and I'm going to file a petition for my 17-year-old daughter in Mexico to immigrate to the United States to live with me, and my husband, who's a Mexican citizen, to immigrate to the United States and live with me, I'm going to file their petition today in 2024, and at this moment, there are visa numbers available for petitions that were filed in February of 2019. So it's going to be 4 years, right? About 4 years waiting for them to immigrate here. Well, 4 years is better than 25. But my daughter continues to age. She's going to turn 18, 19, 20, 21. And if she's over the age of 21 by the time a visa number is available, she's going to fall into that 2A category, which means she's going to have to wait another 16, 17 years. So my husband's going to be able to come in 4 years, but my daughter's going to age out. And she's not going to be able to come for decades. So these are the lines, and this is the result of arbitrary visa numbers that are not tied to any sort of actual family reunification demands, who are not examined by Congress in any legislative session or over 30 years. And the reason why we have so many undocumented people in this country is because of the lines. And it's not just for family, this is employment too. We cap employment green cards at 140,000 per year. Again, an arbitrary number not tied to any sort of economic measure. Department of Labor is never asked to project how many jobs we might need immigrants to fill over the next few years. Right now, the Chamber of Commerce is reporting that there are 3 million open jobs that U.S. citizens seeking work right now cannot fill. So we need 3 million more workers in this country, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So even with employment visas, not every employer can hire for any position, right? They have to meet certain requirements. They have to have the Department of Labor certify that there is no U.S. citizen or permanent resident qualified or willing to take the job before they can file a petition for an alien worker for a green card. But again, those visas are limited. The C means current. I want to draw your attention to the 5th category, those 2 rows at the bottom. You can buy your green card. If you invest $500,000 to $1 million in a project in the United States that's going to employ 10 or more U.S. citizens or permanent residents, you can get a green card. So you can buy one if you want to skip the line. All right, so let's say you've been waiting 20 years for your visa number. The day has come. There's a visa number available. You're guaranteed to get it, right? Oh no, we have a second step. So you have to prove that you do not have certain immigration violations that are going to disqualify you from that visa that you've been waiting 2 decades for. Entering the United States without permission, living here undocumented, will disqualify you unless your petition for you was filed before April 30th, 2001. Then you can pay a $1,000 penalty and apply for your green card here. If that is not your situation, then you have to leave the United States and have your interview at the U.S. consulate in your home country. But if you've been living in the United States for more than 1 year unlawfully, the moment you depart the United States to go to that interview, you are disqualified from getting that visa for 10 years. You have to stay out for 10 years. There's a waiver available if you're married to a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, or if your mother or father is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, but not your children. Children are not qualifying relatives for a waiver. And right now, the waiver processing time is about 3.5 years. So even if you qualify for a waiver, you got to wait about 3.5 years. People who have been convicted of crimes involving moral turpitude are disqualified from getting immigrant visas. Who can tell me what a crime involving moral turpitude is? No, the courts don't even know. That is decided on a statute by statute basis. So if the immigration courts and the federal courts can't even articulate what a crime involving moral turpitude is, because it's such an ambiguous phrase, how can somebody who didn't go to law school in the United States know? If they get arrested for a crime, how can they know before they plead guilty to that crime whether or not it's going to have immigration consequences to them in the future? Anyone convicted of a controlled substance offense is disqualified, and that includes possession of marijuana, unless it's less than 30 grams, and you're married to a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. Then you can do a waiver. So even as states are legalizing cannabis use, including here in Illinois, a lot of non-citizens don't understand that it is not legalized on the federal level, and immigration law is all federal. All right, multiple criminal convictions, prior deportations. People have been deported before and then came back into the United States without permission. They're disqualified. They have to stay out for 10 years. There's no waiver. At the end of the 10 years, they have to apply for special permission to apply for an immigrant visa. Permission that can be denied, so we call that the permanent bar. False claim to citizenship and voting in the United States. We know non-citizens cannot vote in the United States in federal elections. Anyone who lies and says that they're a U.S. citizen to come into the United States or for an immigration benefit are disqualified permanently from ever getting a green card through family or employment. Done. No waivers. And Immigration Services also believes that anyone that marks that they're a U.S. citizen on an I-9 form to work is also disqualified for false claim to citizenship from ever getting a green card. Public charge. People who do not have a sponsor who makes 150% of the poverty guidelines, disqualified from getting a visa. There are a couple of exceptions. Public charge, that means the sponsor signs a contract with the federal government that says, if this immigrant I am sponsoring goes on any sort of cash public benefits, you federal government can seek reimbursement from me for any cash public benefits that this immigrant goes on. And that contract continues until either that immigrant pays 40 qualifying quarters into Social Security, or becomes a U.S. citizen, or leaves the U.S. permanently. Medical grounds. Again, we passed these laws in 1965 or before. We have a different understanding of mental health issues in the 21st century than we did in the 20th, but our immigration laws have not kept up. So you might have a U.S. citizen that has an adult child who has schizophrenia. That might be a huge problem for that child to actually get a green card, a visa to immigrate to the United States. Reasonable ground to believe that an alien will engage in unlawful activity in the United States. This is at the discretion of the consular officer. So if the consular officer looks at you and says, you know what? I think you look like trouble. You know what, that tattoo that you have on your arm, I think that might be gang related. Visa denied. And that's it, because remember, there's no federal court review of immigration decisions. So that's it, not coming. Fraud or misrepresentation. People who lied or used documents that did not belong to them, or fake documents to come into the United States, disqualified from getting their immigrant visa. There's a waiver available if you're married to a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, or if your mother or father's a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. But if you don't qualify for a waiver, you're not coming. And we can guess, which people have committed immigration fraud to come into the United States, use a visa that didn't belong to them to come in. People who might have been arrested for possession of a fake ID. And is that a crime involving moral turpitude? The courts say, no, possession of a fake ID is not a crime involving moral turpitude, but use of a fake ID is. Figure that one out. All right, but let's say your visa number was available, you didn't have any immigration violations that disqualified you. Welcome to the United States of America. Don't unpack. Because now we have a whole list of deportation grounds. So even people that come in the right way, who come in legally, if they get certain immigration violations while they're here, they are deportable. And that includes permanent residents of the United States, green card holders, people here on student visas, people here on tourist visas, people here on employment visas. So anyone who's convicted of an aggravated felony as defined by federal immigration law, not as defined by state criminal law, federal immigration law, not even as defined by federal criminal law, federal immigration law. And that again is on a statute by statute basis. So you can have someone who believes they're pleading guilty to a misdemeanor, which may be under state law, but under federal law, immigration law, it could be construed as a felony and therefore support a ground for deportation. And how are they going to know before they plead guilty to something? A felony conviction for a crime involving moral turpitude within your first 5 years makes a permanent resident or anyone who's here legally deportable. 2 or more convictions for a crime involving moral turpitude. I have seen this one quite a bit with theft crimes. So retail theft is a crime involving moral turpitude. So you could have a permanent resident who's lived in the United States for 30, 40 years. And maybe they got a retail theft in their 20s when they were here, first here, and it was a misdemeanor. Fine, no problem. And then let's say, 20 years later, they pick up another retail theft, misdemeanor, petty offense. Now they're deportable, and they're subject to mandatory immigration detention. Registering to vote or voting in the United States when you are not a citizen makes someone who's here legally deportable. Controlled substance offense, except for 30 grams of cannabis. This one's tricky. This one's really tricky, though. So let's say you have a green card holder or permanent resident who pleads guilty to possession of less than 30 grams of cannabis. They're not deportable. That's fine. But what happens when they leave the United States and they want to come back in under admissibility? Oh, now they're inadmissible. So if you plead guilty to a controlled substance offense as a permanent resident, maybe you should cancel international travel plans. Abandoning status. Green card holders have to live in the United States 6 months of the year, the majority of the year, to retain their permanent resident status. If they do not live here 6 months out of the year, they can be presumed to have abandoned their status, and when they come back in, Customs and Border Protection can be like, hey, you were gone for 8 months. You were gone for over a year. We think you abandoned your status, and put them in deportation proceedings. Overstaying a non-immigrant visa. People that come in with a tourist visa are authorized to be here for 6 months at a time. The tourist visa itself is issued for 10 years at a time, but the authorized stay in the U.S. is usually limited to 6 months. If they overstay that, they're deportable. working without authorization on a non-immigrant visa, like a student visa, an F1 student visa. They're coming here to go to school, they can get an on-campus job, but if they take an off-campus job, or like they house sit for a professor for a weekend and the professor comes back and throws them 20 bucks, that's unauthorized work and now they're deportable. They totally violated their student visa. Tricky, tricky. All right, so what are deportation proceedings? Okay, so people who are not here legally are deportable for that fact alone, that they are not here legally. That makes them deportable. People who are here legally might have immigration violations that also make them deportable. So what do? Well, our entire deportation system is set up under the executive branch. The immigration courts are civil, administrative, federal courts, which are not Article 3 courts under the judicial branch. They are under the executive branch. And because they're civil proceedings, not criminal proceedings, there are limited due process rights. When you're charged with a crime, your legal status in this country doesn't matter. If you're charged with a crime, the full protections of our U.S. Constitution come into play, right? You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you don't have an attorney, you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. You don't get that in civil proceedings. Anyone who's ever filed a civil case, like filed for divorce, do you get a free lawyer automatically? No. There's a public defender's office for criminal proceedings, state or federal. There's no public defender's office for immigration proceedings because it's civil. There's mandatory detention for people charged with certain immigration violations. If they're not subject to mandatory detention, an immigration judge can set a bond for them to get out of detention, but because it's a civil bond, you have to pay 100%. So if the judge sets the bond at $20,000, you got to come up with $20,000 to get out of immigration detention and fight your case. Immigration judges are employees of the Department of Justice. ICE attorneys are like the prosecutors in immigration court. That's what they are. And they are employees of the Department of Homeland Security. And they're lawyers, the immigration judges are lawyers, and there is no public defender's office. So, does having a lawyer in immigration court make a difference? Yeah, it makes a huge difference. When you have someone that can help you navigate what you're eligible for, hold the government to their burden of proof, yeah, it makes a difference. About 49% of aliens who had a lawyer were granted relief from deportation, so they were not in fact deported. Only 15% of those who didn't have a lawyer were granted relief from deportation. All right, so executive authority and asylum. Last week, President Biden announced a policy to prohibit people from asking for asylum at the border if certain events happen, like so many people come to the border, automatically, border's going to close, nobody can ask for asylum at our border. Also, he changed the policy from Customs and Border Protection agents from asking people, do you have a fear of being deported to your home country, to now the burden is on the people. They have to say, I have a fear of being deported to my home country. Otherwise, they're not going to be eligible for asylum. So it's pretty harsh. It's very harsh, especially when the law says, the law, not executive policy, the law says anyone has the right to apply for asylum regardless of manner of entry to the United States. That's what the law is. So the law doesn't say only people who come in with a visa, only people who have an appointment can apply for asylum. It's regardless of manner of entry. So people who cross the border without permission, without inspection, they still have the right under the law to apply for asylum. So already lawsuits have been filed to put a halt to that policy as it contradicts federal law on asylum. President Biden has done some other things to try and regulate the numbers of people coming into our border, but remember, the vast majority of people, whatever's pushing them out of their home country or pulling them to the United States, do not have any other way to apply to come into the United States except for to show up at our border and ask for asylum. That's the law that they can try. It doesn't mean they qualify for asylum. Doesn't mean ultimately they're going to get asylum. But they can ask for it, make the application, have the application heard, and a decision entered. If the asylum application is denied, they'll be deported. But to try and regulate the people who are leaving, primarily Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua, President Biden said, okay, I'm going to use my executive authority to allow people to apply for parole before they come to the border. So if they have a sponsor in the United States who meets the income requirements, and they don't have a disqualifying criminal record, don't pose a danger to the United States, they can make an application for parole. If it gets approved, they can pick up their travel document from the U.S. consulate in their home country, and then they can get on a plane and fly into the United States, and they can get a work permit right away. And the parole will be good for 2 years. That's it. Then it expires. What happens after that, I guess, depends on Congress or the next president. So that was one way to try and regulate the flow of people coming to the United States. But of course, people who don't have a sponsor in the United States, that's not an avenue open to them. We also have parole programs for undocumented parents and spouses of U.S. citizens enlisted in the U.S. military, which is an actual law now, signed by Trump. So certain undocumented spouses and parents can get permission to be in the United States if their spouse or child is a veteran of the U.S. military or currently enlisted in the U.S. military. And parole, again, is permission to be in the United States. In that case, it's for 1 year. And you can get a work permit, but the work permit will expire when your parole expires, and work permit processing times typically exceed 6 months, sometimes a year. Asylum, we talked about asylum. Now refugees. Refugees are different from asylum seekers. Refugees are people who have already had their asylum application approved while outside of the United States. So these are people who have already proved that they have been or will be persecuted on account of something they can't change about themselves, race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So they've already proven that, they've already been screened, they've been waiting in a refugee camp for a really long time, and now they've been offered to resettle in the United States. And that's what World Relief does. They help refugees who have already proven their case outside of the United States to resettle in the U.S. And so they come in legally, and after they've been here for a year, they can apply for green cards. Asylum seekers are people who have not yet made their application for asylum, or they filed it, but it hasn't been decided yet. It certainly hasn't been approved yet. Asylum seekers also, if they qualify for work authorization only after their asylum application has been filed with either the Immigration Court or U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and has been pending for 150 days. Only after that can they make an application for a work permit, and the work permit will take additional time to process. People who come in parole can get work permits right away. People who come in as refugees, authorized to work right away. People who come in with green cards, authorized to work right away. All right, so, well, our problem is we just need more guns at the border, and that would deter people from coming to the United States. What I find so curious about the immigration debate is the headlines that I read are, you know, 20,000 people came to the U.S. border this month. Okay, and? Well, it implies that people just wanting to come to the United States is somehow a problem. People wanting to come here is a problem. People wanting to come here is somehow an insult or a threat to the world's only remaining superpower. Well, maybe the problem isn't the fact that people want to come here. Maybe the problem is that we do not have an orderly and fair process for people to follow to come to the United States. If you think about it like this, let's pretend I-90 had not received any maintenance in 58 years. How many cars, even cars driven by people who have driver's licenses, how many cars would be able to drive down I-90 at a time? And then when you think about our productive economy, and then more drivers, and maybe even heavier vehicles as a product of our technological advances, would ordering and hiring more state troopers to patrol I-90 or sit on the shoulder make I-90 more drivable? No. Our immigration system is a highway that hasn't been repaved in 58 years. So it doesn't really matter how many more Customs and Border Protection agents you hire. It doesn't really matter how many National Guardies you want to deploy to the U.S. border. It's not going to make our system more navigable. All right, so yeah, border apprehensions are at an all-time high, although what's different between 2000 and 2013, and 2013 marked the year that more Mexican nationals began leaving the United States than attempting to come into the United States, 2013. But what also is different is now instead of seeing single males coming to the U.S. seeking work, we're seeing more family groups because, you know, the situation in our neighboring countries is different. People aren't just seeking economic opportunity and being drawn by work, by jobs. They're being pushed out because of poverty and corruption and civil strife and natural disasters. Honduras has been hit particularly hard by hurricanes and really has destroyed the livelihood of many farmers in Honduras. And so they feel pushed out and come to the United States seeking opportunity. Now, the U.S. is experiencing a time when fewer American citizens want to go into agriculture and have farms. It seems like there might be a solution between those two things, don't you think? Maybe not. All right. All right, but immigrants, they're invading us. There are so many that want to come here, and we're overwhelmed. You know, we're a nation of over 330 million people, and less than 1 million people a year want to come in. It's craziness. These are the same arguments that we've heard throughout the history of immigration in the United States. Immigrants, there are too many. They're bringing disease, famine, poverty, and they're all criminals. And they're putting us in danger. So I like this political cartoon. It says the balance of trade with Great Britain seems to be still against us, and it has a poorhouse full of poor Irish people coming over to the U.S. Because remember, the Irish were not welcome in the U.S. because they were poor and they were dirty. And then we have Asian immigrants. And this political cartoon has Asian immigrants' heads on the bodies of locusts. Because Asian immigrants are going to come over and destroy American prosperity. They're going to eat all of our crops and cause famine. They're an invasive species. And then this political cartoon was against Italian immigration. Because Italians were all criminals. And you see, these are Italian immigrants' heads on the bodies of rats being dumped into U.S. harbors. And some of them even have hats that say things like mafia. So these same arguments to restrict immigration that we are hearing today, even on the floor of Congress today, are the same arguments that have been made in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the mid 1900s, and even today. And I would argue those are born not to be true. I think that most Asian Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans are pretty proud of their immigration, their immigrant ancestors coming over to the U.S. And I think that we've acclimated pretty well. All right, Customs and Border Protection. You can see how the U.S. public kind of feels about immigrants based on where Congress moves the immigration office. Immigrants started out under the Treasury Department because immigrants were seen as a revenue source back at the beginning. Then in the 1920s, it was moved under the Labor Department because it was seen as an economic issue. We need to protect American jobs, so it was a labor issue. After World War II and the atrocities, it was moved to the Justice Department because immigration was seen as a justice issue. And then after the 9/11 terror attacks, immigration has been viewed as a security issue. And so now immigration is under the Department of Homeland Security. So you can kind of see how the American public feels about immigrants based on where the immigration office is moved. So Customs and Border Protection. They are the largest federal law enforcement agency in our country. They have over 60,000 employees. And I don't think most Americans realize this, but CBP processes over 1 million travelers per day. Not per month, not per year, per day in this country at all of our ports of entry. Granted, it's not just at one port of entry. It's not at, the 3 that people at our southern border are coming to. It's across the United States. So this is a very powerful agency. This is a very well-funded agency. This is an agency that is capable of a lot. But they need a Congress willing to help them out by kind of spreading out the people's ability to enter at other ports of entry instead of just 3 at our southern border because they're on foot and they don't have travel documents. The Biden administration created an app called CBP One, and that app allows people to make an appointment at one of our southern ports of entry. Started over, supposed to make it more orderly. The problem is 3 to 4 months before there's an appointment, and then people ask for it without permission, and then they go look for different entries without inspection. When people were coming and looking for jobs, they were trying to avoid Customs and Border Protection agents. Now, people cross, they want. Okay, but we have to be safe. So the best way to be safe is to build a wall. A wall is not a new idea when it comes to restricting in this country. Physical exclusion acts are walls. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a wall to keep out Chinese immigrants. So walls are actually not a new idea, and as it turns out, they don't seem to work real well. Other walls are like literacy tests, putting in very restrictive requirements on immigrants, limiting visas from certain countries. Turns out that didn't work out real well. So in the immigration debate, I think that you have people that just want an immigration system that works, will agree what the problems are, and just want them fixed. They want it more orderly, they want it to be fair, humane, and work for the United States. And then on this hand, you have immigration restrictionists, nativists. These are the same arguments and the same kind of thought that was very popular in the early 1900s, which gave rise to the Literacy Acts restricting immigration from Southern Europe and creating more grounds of deportation. And these are people that really are not interested in solving or making an immigration system more efficient. They want to control what types of immigrants are coming to the United States. So when you talk to somebody about immigration, it's always helpful if you can identify which type of person you're talking to. Someone who's really interested in solving this problem, or someone who just doesn't want certain types of people coming in. All right, well, this is the immigration system that we have, as unpleasant as it is. This is a Customs and Border Protection agent trying to grab a Haitian immigrant who's in the tent city waiting to see if he could come into the U.S. The United States has directed Customs and Border Protection to keep people out of our borders. That is their directive. They are federal employees. They follow orders. This is what it is. This Haitian immigrant, this is even before CBP 1 Act. He had no way to make an appointment at a port of entry. All right, so why do we care? Well, we're living in a time, maybe the first time in our history, that our population growth is slowing in the United States. And our population is aging in the United States. And we've already become more diverse in the United States. So, if we want economic growth also requires population growth. If you have a lot of people retiring and a lot fewer people entering the workforce, maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's a problem the United States has always depended on immigration to solve. All right, for people who are concerned about the changing complexion of the United States and what an American should look like, well, the white population is already going to be a minority by 2045, so that ship's already sailed. Maybe I'm a pragmatist. All right, so U.S. population growth. You know, instead of a headline about lots of people want to come to the United States, how about fewer Americans are being born in the United States? Fewer Americans exist to fill the jobs that we need to grow our economy. All right. So here's our estimated population growth by age. Anyone see any concerns with the 65 to 75 age group versus the 15 and under, 15 to 24, 25 to 34? I think this might be a good topic of conversation for our nation to have, and immigration absolutely has a role to play here. You know, this is a really good reason why we need a Congress willing to talk about how our immigration system can be modernized to meet the coming population challenges that we are facing. All right, so race and ethnic contributions. The fastest growing population in the United States is the Latino population, and then the Asian American population. After that, Black, and then 2 or more races. So the complexion of America has already changed, and we can embrace it or we can be afraid. Okay, undocumented immigrants, state and local taxes. How can undocumented immigrants pay taxes? They don't have a social security number. They're not authorized to work. Well, luckily, the IRS doesn't care if you're authorized to work. If you have earned income in this country, the IRS will give you what's called an individual taxpayer identification number so you can file your taxes. So ITIN returns is how we know how much undocumented immigrants are paying in taxes, state, local, and federal. And then there are projections that have been, like here in Illinois, we have about 400,000 undocumented immigrants in the state of Illinois. So on this chart, which I know is really hard to read, but you can see state by state how much they pay in, and then if they were allowed to get legal status and legit social security numbers and be able to work like real people, the tax change. How much more is projected to be paid in state revenues?
Something went wrong.
Now, last I heard, one of Illinois' problems wasn't having too much in state revenues. Okay, immigrants and Social Security. Okay, so immigrants pay into Social Security because they work under Social Security numbers that don't belong to them. They work under made-up Social Security numbers. Some even work under ITIN numbers. So employers are deducting FICA from their paychecks. They send it to Social Security, and Social Security says, hey, this isn't a legitimate number, or hey, this number doesn't match the name. This is a mismatch. What do we do with it? Employer doesn't respond. Social Security puts it in the suspense file because they don't know who to credit it to, that money that's paid in. So we know how much is in the suspense file, and we know where it's coming from. It's coming from people who are not authorized to work in this country. And so undocumented immigrants pay about $13 billion per year to Social Security. So people who are getting your Social Security right now, boomers, undocumented immigrants, say you're welcome. Gen X, me, when I turn 62 in 10 years, I'm not going to get my full Social Security. So maybe I also want more immigrants coming into the U.S. in prime working age, as they typically do, and start working and paying into Social Security so I can get my full benefits. That hasn't hit Gen X yet, but the day's coming when it will, that reality. All right, so why don't we have a fair immigration system that meets our economic, humanitarian, and security needs? Well, the problem is that we don't identify the correct problem. We're not having conversations about what the real problem is. We have an immigration system that is almost 60 years old, that has not been modernized, has not been repaid, has not been tinkered with to keep up with 21st century demands. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to talk about legalizing the people who are here, already integrated into our communities and contributing through paying taxes and working and married to U.S. citizens. A broad legalization program would also clear out the immigration court backlog, which is currently at about 3 million. So Customs and Border Protection can arrest people, order them for deportation proceedings, but an immigration judge is not going to be available to hear the case for maybe 3, 4, 5 years. So what are they going to do in the meantime? Use civil detention sparingly, make the immigration courts an Article I specialty court under the judicial branch, kind of like bankruptcy courts are, hire more immigration judges, pass a real worker visa program that actually meets employer needs, which ours currently does not do. And then increase the family employment numbers to clear out the existing lines. And then those should be updated according to needs. So then we don't have decades-long waiting for families to reunify. And then, if we're concerned about people being pushed out of their home countries, one of the things that we have done and can do is effectively fund humanitarian aid and support diplomacy. Diplomacy tends to be a better investment than more guns. All right, so what's the problem again? Congress is the problem. All right, so immigration laws are purely under the jurisdiction of Congress per the Constitution. Only Congress has the power to regulate immigration. Presidents don't. Presidents can only work in the gray areas of the laws that Congress has passed. So if we want immigration reform, you need to talk to your U.S. senators and your U.S. representative. And maybe Gen Z and millennials, if they all vote, they can outvote boomers and Gen X, and then our Congress would look very different. All right. There have been pending pieces of legislation. The Dignity Act of 2023 from last year was actually bipartisan, written by a congresswoman from Texas and one from Florida. It would go a long way to modernizing the system and helping make it more workable, but it got nowhere. It got absolutely nowhere, even though it was bipartisan. So Biden is working in the gray areas. He has the asylum bans to show he's tough on immigration, serious about securing the border. And then yesterday he announced a parole in place program for some undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens. So they could get permission to be in the United States if they've been here for at least 10 years, don't have certain immigration violations, don't have a certain criminal record, and if they get parole, if they get permission to be here, then they can apply for the green card here. They wouldn't have to go out, they wouldn't have to do the waiver. So it would go a long way to stabilizing a lot of families that are in mixed status with a U.S. citizen parent and an undocumented parent. But they have to have been married as of Monday. So people that have been living together for 20 years and have 4 kids together who haven't bothered to get married, nope, that program won't help them. And then there's a policy change for some DACA holders that will maybe help them become eligible to apply for employment visas if they have employers willing to sponsor them. So those were 2 very positive policy changes. But I have no doubt at least one state will probably sue to stop these policy changes from going into effect. All right. So what can you do about immigration? Take a breath and remind yourself that we are a strong country. We are a strong country. We're the world's most productive country. You know, we've got the largest economy in the world. If we want to keep that up, we can make some changes to make sure that we keep that up. Okay, so if you want to talk to somebody about immigration, identify who you're talking to, and also, you know, strike up the conversation about immigration. Someone says something about immigration. Well, people need to follow the law. Oh, I agree. People need to follow the law. But are you aware our laws are from 1965? No, I didn't know that. What if I told you not everyone has a right way to apply? What if I told you employers, there aren't enough visas for employers to hire the workers that they need? Know who your local, state, and federal elected representatives are and call them. Have these conversations with your elected officials at every level. If you're a member of League of Women Voters, sign up for the immigration listserv. Kim Reed sends out emails every day with updates. She's great. Write a letter to the editor. And if all else fails, run for office yourself.
Thank you. At this time, do we have questions from our moderators?
Questions? We have one. But I don't think this one's working. I have to turn it on.
I think only one mic person.
All right, second. Here, I'll just. Questions?
Okay, the first question is sanctuary an ideology or a law, and how is it applied and what are its implications?
That is a fantastic question. Fantastic. Thank you for asking that, whoever did. So, sanctuary is something, a law created by the Supreme Court called the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. This first came up during the time of the Fugitive Slave Act. Whether or not the federal government could force local law enforcement in certain northern states to be enlisted to round up slaves that southern slave catchers were pursuing in the north. Then it came up again with the Brady Bill, with the Gun Act, remember? That was a federal law that required, mandated that county sheriffs do background checks for FOID cards, and it was part of a federal scheme. And so the Supreme Court said, oh no, Congress, you cannot force a state or local government to do the federal government's job for them. So it's called the anti-commandeering doctrine. Immigration law is all federal law. We have a federal agency called Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is tasked with going out and finding people in violation of our immigration law, making a civil arrest, and putting them in deportation proceedings. So under the anti-commandeering doctrine, ICE cannot require police departments and sheriff's departments to engage in federal civil law enforcement actions. Because remember, immigration law is civil. So the word sanctuary has come to mean local law enforcement will not operate in federal civil enforcement. That's what it is. And here in Illinois passed the Trust Act, which states state and federal criminal law enforcement officers are not allowed to cooperate with immigration enforcement. The feds need to do and use their own money to do their own job. So that's what it is.
Is there anything a local community can do to have a difference with?
Yes, get Congress to make the system simpler and more fair. It's kind of immigrants. I mean, it really doesn't matter whether they're coming here with green card, asylum application, or they're here on a student visa, or they're here on a tourist visa. We can be welcoming communities. And like with World League, and nations welcome people to this country however themselves here. But the big thing is really laws. That requires engagement, citizen engagement with voting and talking to elected representatives.
This is a lengthy answer, but generally, how does the state's immigration system compare to other Western democracies?
Well, I'm a U.S. I'm only licensed in the United States, so I can't say to all other countries. But this is what I can say. The United States of America is an immigrant nation, so shouldn't we have a system that is so good that all nations want to us? No better than we, if we choose to. That being said, my personal Canada, good friend Canada, which Canadian first, but our we country should be a, but that's what our is doing. So I think it is worthwhile to look at what others are doing and why they're doing it, and maybe we should be doing it better because we are our own in 50 years.
Okay, this is a question about the Southern Poverty Law Center. The person is saying, I thought it was against hate groups, but one of your mentions the
Slide. The Poverty Law Center has studied hate. The Poverty Law Center in 2009 studied the Native Body, the three phases were released. Being the main list in restriction groups. So, Federation for American U.S. Center for Immigration. Center for Immigration is the most insidious of organizations identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center because CIS has gone mainstream. Have gone mainstream, and when news outlets want to immigrant, they see immigration, right? But that's like going to the KKK for a viewpoint. Really is so difficult to have productive conversation because this life have the of these arguments on old political cycle any elected officials. So it's a very good. It's not really written in 2000.
I'm not sure you'll be able to answer it. My friend from my area legally get here in 2021.
People that come in legally usually with a visa, right? And either it could be a student visa, and then they graduate from school, they have work authorization. If they get hired by a U.S. employer, the U.S. employer can sponsor them for an employment visa, and then from there, they might be able to get a green card eventually. Been married to a U.S. citizen and came in with an immigrant visa, or their parent came in on an immigrant visa and they were a derivative on that application. Or they could have come in on a tourist visa and simply overstayed, and you may not know if they're here legally now. They might have come in legally, but they may not be here legally now. You never know. And certainly, you can't tell if somebody is a U.S. citizen just by looking at them. You can't tell if somebody is here legally or not legally just by looking at them, or even by how they talk, and even if they don't speak English. We have plenty of U.S. citizens in this who actually speak English.
That's all then. Thank you again for